You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
It is May 27th, 2021. It is 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And this is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. And tonight, I wanted to continue talking about the path to enlightenment, which we started last time, but mainly focusing on the first stage of the 16 stages of enlightenment. If you want a reference book for it, the Manual of Insight by Mahasi Sayadaw is a good reference. And what we're talking about here is knowledge that discerns mental from physical phenomenon. Sometimes I think at the beginning of this, you might wonder why that would be an important thing to do. The answer would be that we want to be able to see clearly what's actually happening and understand how we interpret that. So what is the data that's coming in? How do we process the data? And then what do we make that data into? It's one way to do it. As we started this evening, we were talking about mentalizing, which is also a piece that I wanted to include in this. Because some of us had good mentalizing training or metacognition training, and some of us didn't. And as you proceed with your practice, it's important to be able to mentalize well so that you can begin to have the kind of insights that are necessary to lead to enlightenment. So you have the five senses that you're used to, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. And then in Buddhist thought, you have mind as an activity. You have the capacity to sense, that's what this is. And then mind makes it into what you understand it to be. And how present are you for that process of taking the raw sensing experience and forming it into something? At the beginning, we're just trying to pry open a little bit of the top so that you can see into this this nature of the human experience. And it can go quite deep, and there's a lot of levels to it. In the beginning, you probably don't have the skill, the resolution to see into the more subtler levels or the more advanced practices. And so I like to also talk about this as a skills training, so that you develop the capacity to experience the things that you need to experience in order to make sense out of this. If you don't have good concentration, you won't be able to do the meditation techniques well enough to begin to have these insights. And so it's important to begin to start there. We talked about that last week as the development of access concentration, being able to maintain an awareness of the object long enough that you have the direct experience of both the sensing of it and the knowing what that sensing experience is. So you might say that you have the capacity to sense, which is eye consciousness, and you have the capacity to know what that sensing experience is, which would be eye-mind consciousness. If you have sensing and seeing, and the same is true in hearing, and then feeling the body, taste and smell. If you look at the whole picture, one of the metaphors that Shinzen used to use, if you look at the monitor screen that you're looking at, is it what you're seeing? So the window of the Zoom meeting is open, and there are 6 or 7 windows on it, depending on how you've arranged it. 2 people are present, and so you have a representation of them, and 4 people have their cameras off, so you're not really sure. 2 people have pictures up, and 2 people are just text. It's very hard to understand what a text person might be like based on that, based on a name. or the picture. There's more detail in the picture. How did you make up your understanding of each of those people that you were looking at? And can you discern clearly one sensation from another? That's also something that happens quite often in the beginning of practice. If you're in the body and the request is for you to tease apart emotional sensations from physical sensations or non-emotional sensations, you have clarity to be able to do that or not. When you look out at the visual field that's outside with the eyes open, is that experience so dominant that you lose track of the internal visual experience? Or can you hold both an awareness of the visual experience externally and internally at the same time? One of the things that creates this perception of the self and the world coming in from the outside is this lack of resolution of internal visual thinking when the eyes are open and you're seeing external sight space. It does also help create this impression that the world is coming in and we're experiencing what's out there. This is very different than the way that Buddhist thought regards it. We take in the sensing experience, and we process it for vagueness, the Pali word for that. Feeling tones is the common English translation for that. I like to talk about it as urgency. It's the processing order. You take in a sensing experience and it's evaluated for whether or not it's important or unimportant, whether it's a response to danger or something pleasant, and ordered in terms of when it is processed and dealt with by the whole system of the body-mind. I quote this quite a bit because I love the starkness of the numbers, but a French group of neuroscientists calculated the processing speed of the body-mind in its totality and came up with a number of 11 million bits per second. And then they evaluated the processing speed of consciousness, so 16 bits, 1/6. So in each moment of consciousness, you experience 16 out of 11 million pieces of information. And this begins to point to the nature of the experience of I am a self, and I am a solid self that is doing things. We would call that volition in meditation terms, the intention action. You make an intention, which is the volition, which is the mind, and then the body takes the action. So it's not even the same there. So opening this up, changing the identification from this whole self that has qualities to it that you experience as permanent, and seeing clearly what actually is happening, which is almost all experience is unconscious and not knowable. Some experience is conscious. Why would that make sense, to have most of the experience unconscious and some of the experience conscious? I like to talk about it in terms of veto power, that you have the capacity to sense, you meet the object that can be sensed, or the contact with the sensing capacity. So you have the capacity to sense, you have the object that can be sensed. And when they meet, the consciousness of that sensing experience arises. Sorry, I forgot to turn on mute. So if the object that can be sensed, the capacity to sense it, when they meet, contact happens, and a consciousness of that sensing experience arises. Awareness knows that. It's then evaluated for processing speed. The brain science on processing speed is pretty good. It's initial studies that have been replicated. If it's urgent, it processes in about 3/8 of a second. If it's neutral, it probably doesn't get processed into consciousness. And if it's pleasant, it takes about a half a second to enter into consciousness. There's a lag in consciousness itself, which is about a half a second behind. They've studied this as well. They notice they apply pressure, and then the person acknowledges the pressure, and the interval between that is consistently about a half a second. So that conscious experience that you have of yourself in charge of everything is actually half a second behind what's actually happening. You're already doing whatever it is that you're doing by the time that experience arises. This is what the human condition actually is. And so what we are asking you to do in these early stages of meditation is to see what is happening clearly, and understanding that that's how it is. So you have the capacity to sense, which in seeing would be your retina, which is sensitive to light. If there's light, you can see the light. And then you take in the light, and then you compare that pattern of sensing to the database, and then you generate an image that maps onto that pattern of sensing experience, which is based on your conditioning. So one way to talk about that might be your previous experience of experiencing things and making them into something. There's a record of that, and you compare the unfixated present moment to that database. And then if you get close enough to a match, then the information about that attaches to the undifferentiated sensing experience, and it becomes a conceptual reality. It becomes solid. If it becomes solid, that would suggest that before it becomes solid, it's just vibratory energy. Not the energy of the thing itself, but the energy of the capacity to sense it. And so what we're really asking in this first stage is to begin to open up to the possibility that the sensing experience and the object that is being sensed are not the same, and that the interpretation of the sensing experience and the object are not the same. It was actually cybernetics and Gregory Bayston who was the first person I read to understand this. His famous saying is along the lines of, you can sit on a chair, but you cannot sit on the idea of a chair. So you have in your mind a sense, if I say chair, you probably have a dozen or more visualizations of what a chair might be, none of which you can sit on. But if you recognize the chair and moved your body to it, you could sit on that chair, so that the differentiation between the physical object and how we know the object is different. And we want to begin to pull that apart and see it clearly. One of the metaphors that Shinzen used to use is a tapestry. We want to pull it apart and see the individual threads, the color of the individual threads, and then we want to be able to zoom out and see the whole of the tapestry. I didn't complete the metaphor I was using about the computer screen. But if you zoomed in on your computer screen, you would not see a closer and closer and closer version of what you were looking at. At a certain point, you see these lights, red, green, and blue. There's no white on your computer screen. There's no black on your computer screen. The full range of colors comes from this combination of red, green, and blue diodes at different levels of brightness. And then the mind takes in that light pattern and creates, based on the perceptual database that you have, the images that you then represent. So faces, colors, all of that is made in the body-mind, And each of us makes it based on our own conditioning, so that there isn't a universal version of this that exists that we all share. There is our conditioning that meets in the moment the phenomena that's happening now and creates out of that interaction of the experience that we're having. I do also like to add imagination to this, which I think is important. One of the things that happens when we're experiencing something unique or new, if we don't have entries in the database that match closely enough, then the imagination kicks in and begins to try and construct a representation of what it is that's happening. And our imagination can be affected by conditioning. If, for instance, you grow up in a household where over and over again you long for something and attempt to get it, and over again you're unable to get it, it is possible to begin to pinch off or limit the capacity to imagine something, which then affects your capacity later in life to imagine different responses to situations that happen. I'd like to think of this as one of the effects that leads to samsara, the experiences that we know and the limiting of our capacity to imagine or to see all of the possibilities that open in front of us because of our previous conditioning creates this pattern of choice where we over and over again pick things that we know over things that we might not know and therefore be uncomfortable with. In a quantum physics term, in each moment, what opens up, in each moment, what opens up are all of the possibilities that you could choose. And if your view is clear and expansive, and you can pick up all of those possibilities, then you have this incredible range of things that you might choose in each moment. But if the mind is restricted, if the database, the conditioning is restricted, if the imagination is restricted, then we tend to see the things that are familiar to us, and all of the other possibilities are unseen, and so we pick over and over again in this habitual way, even if it isn't useful to us. So opening that up, seeing that, is part of what this investigation is. Knowing what the sensing experience is, knowing what we make it into, and then really tracking our intention and action, taking in the outcome, and then adding that to the database so that the next time that kind of experience arises, we have additional information about how we might respond, which is one of the ways to move into a virtuous cycle rather than staying in a afflictive cycle. Mentalizing is a term, or metacognition is a term where you can track your experience, track your thinking experience, track your reactions and monitor this. In the West, that early experience of the dyadic relationship with the caregiver is where you learn the basics of mentalizing. And then when you're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, you develop a second track, which is mainly the autobiographical conditioning experience. So I just want to parse them a little bit. In the beginning, the experience of the infant is to express themselves authentically to no one in particular. When you're born, you have a sensitivity to the voice of your birth mother and not really anyone else. You're more reactive to the sound of your birth mother's voice, but you're not more attached to her. I know it is biologically possible for a man to carry a fertilized egg to birth, but it just doesn't happen very often. So you'll forgive my defaulting to the female sex for this. So we're all born, we're all autoregulators, we're all just entirely self-absorbed in the beginning. Our brains haven't developed to the point that we can even recognize that we are different from everything else. There's a gaze there that might be useful if we could come back into that. Can you? You can't, of course. It's rhetorical. Could you imagine just looking out at the world and having a completely empty database, so there's nothing to know? You just have the pure sensing experience, and you don't make it into anything because there's nothing in the database to match it to. You just see that open gaze of all experience. You're in the present moment. As sensations arise in the body, as discomforts arise in the body, you express them. In the beginning, it's authentic. And then hopefully you have a sensitive enough caregiver who then responds to those cries. I say cry, of course, but that isn't the first thing that infants do. The first thing infants do is look cute. There's a study that shows that the first attachment behavior exhibited by newborn infants is at around 42 minutes, and it's a reflexive smile. If some of you have had children or have been around infants, you'll recognize that anything that really moves in front of their gaze will elicit this smile, which is very easy to interpret as meant intentionally for you, the looker, but actually in the beginning, it's just instinctive. And then you call out to the world, you look as cute as you can. Imagine what your view of the world would be, your expectations of the world were if all you had to do is look really cute and all your needs are taken care of. This is the actual experience of some people. It's the thing that leads to security. But if that doesn't happen, then there's a confusing look. If you've ever been around secure children and seen them make an initial request for some kind of attention or care, and then it doesn't happen right away, they look confused because they're used to the level of care that's very reliable, very predictable. Then this process happens where the caregiver comes, if they come reliably enough, the child's brain develops and their attention turns toward somebody else to help take care of them. And they feel free to express what they want, and the caregiver responds to that. And there's a loop that gets created. The infant expresses authentically what they need. The sensitive enough caregiver interprets the expression of the infant, understands what the infant might need, and then provides that for the infant. So you're hungry, you're too hot, you're too cold, you're wet, all of the different things that arise, all of the different expressions, facial and sound, that the infant makes, that the sensitive enough caregiver interprets and understands and then responds to. If that happens in a good enough way, and the caregiver is mirroring back to the infant what those expressions mean. So imagine the infant is upset and angry about something, and then the caregiver mirrors back the expression of anger and says, "Oh, you're angry." And if that's correct, then the child understands that, oh, this experience I'm having is reflected back at me, so that I begin to understand what that is. And then I make a request for some kind of care. And then if the caregiver reliably provides that, then I know if I make that expression, then I'm likely to receive that kind of care. That's that process, that early process of developing mentalizing. So when we talk about this, I like to do it in a structured way so it's easy to discuss. And I'm using the Peter Fonagy, Anthony Bateman, the system here in describing that early mentalizing experience that we might have learned as infants and small children from the relationship with our caregivers. First, the spontaneity of just the uninterrupted flow of what's happening, and then the capacity to monitor it. That's the first dimension of mentalizing. The second then is that I'm a self that's distinct from other people, and other people are distinct from me, that division. Then the internal versus external. This is the internal experience I'm having, and that's the external place where I can take stimulus in. And then the last one is cognitive versus affective, or thinking versus feeling. In Buddhist thought, the heart and the mind are not separate. And so we know thinking, but we also know feeling as the same dimension. It was in the West, in Western philosophy, where we cleaved reason from feeling, and is often taught that way. But when you think about it, actually, and reason actually was always held up as the better of the two. One doesn't want to get too emotional. One wants to be able to think clearly. But when you think about it, emotion preceded the cognitive mind evolutionarily, and it isn't the emotions that turn off in most people when they get stressed. It's the ability to think clearly that gets turned off. That's why I think there's a bias, and without that monitoring, that conscious monitoring of what's happening, we just take actions. We form intentions and take we form intentions and take actions based on our conditioning. It's very common for people to say to me that they wanted to be a completely different parent than the parenting that they had, and at the same time find themselves often repeating the kind of parenting that they didn't want to repeat. And this is this process of the cognitive and the affective. And also one of the things that we're attempting to develop in this understanding of basic meditation practice. So there's 4 dimensions of this basic meditation practice. See if I can get them. Concentration, sensory clarity, mindfulness. That's the 4th one. One of the things about my mind, which I find really half the time quite annoying and half the time quite humorous, is that I can remember lists -1, and I can repeat the same list over and over again. And it's not always the same one that I miss. Energy is the last one. So energy, sensory clarity, mindfulness, which means awareness of the present moment, and concentration are the basic skills of Vipassana meditation. Those need to be in concert. And then we can turn our attention to the objects that we want to explore. So in developing a sensitivity or the knowledge that mental and physical phenomena are not the same thing, we want to see clearly that you have the capacity to sense something, but that is not what you make that sensing experience into. We have the capacity to discern things, but that is not the sensing experience. Without the sensing experience and the discernment, we can't make conceptual reality out of ultimate reality. One of my favorite metaphors around this is a drum. You have a drum. There is no drum sound in the drum. You have the stick with which you beat the drum. There is no drum sound in the stick with which you use to beat the drum. And yet, when you beat the drum with the stick, the phenomena of the drum beat arises in the present moment. And if you take in the sensing experience and process it consciously, you know that that is the sound of a drum beat. But without all of those pieces together, there is no permanent ongoing quality of drum beat stored either in the drum or in the stick or in your capacity to sense it. It all happens in the experience of the present moment. Is that making sense? So, in traditional Buddhist thought, we divide that out into the skandhas or the 5 aggregates. And I, because I'm an old Shin head, we like to say, or an old Shinzen student, like to use the see, hear, feel technique. In the way that he usually teaches see, hear, feel, we don't have the overlay of mind. So I also want you to pay attention to that when we start meditating. Mind knows what things are. It's what makes things into something, but it also is the thing that directs where your attention goes and collects the snapshots or the mind moments that you then use to create the experience of conceptual reality. So when you're paying attention to this, without interfering or in any way directing your attention towards something, simply follow as your attention moves from object to object and know this to be the one of the qualities of mind, where your attention is drawn. We do not take in everything that's happening and then create an accurate depiction of what's happening. We have a hierarchy of preferences which mind will direct us to. So we tend to pull out of the whole landscape the things that are interesting to us, and we don't tend to focus on the things that aren't interesting to us. And so we begin to create these tableaus or these experiences of what's out there, which is not an accurate representation of what's out there, but a very curated selection of what we find interesting that's out there, and then creating the experience. You may notice that if you walk into an environment and there are not enough objects that have interest to you, then there's either a devaluing process of the environment or the suggestion that the environment is boring, whatever it is that your conditioning reacts to a paucity of the kinds of objects that you like to pay attention to. You create a series of snapshots. I like to call them punch outs. You punch out these little pieces of information from the environment, and then you assemble your experience of the environment from that list. Selective focus is what we call it in Western psychology. I'll give you an example. I went to a therapist. He had an office on Bedford Street in Beverly Hills. If you live in Los Angeles, you know that Bedford Street in Beverly Hills and Ventura Boulevard and Encino are the 2 therapy hotspots. And so I went into his office, I sat down and I looked down and there was a rug on the floor that I thought was new. And I said to him, "You got a new rug, and it's really beautiful." And he said, yeah, I got the rug 6 months ago. You've been here 20 times since I got the rug. And now you're noticing. The mind will over and over again create a tableau, particularly if you're used to the environment that you're in that may not even be current. Um, Another example was we had misplaced the wrench that we were looking for. We're moving offices, so there's a little bit of this and that construction, and was right in the center of the floor. And two of us were standing there looking for it, and neither one could see it because we'd been in the space so many times. We were using an old image of the space. We didn't create a new image of the space that was actually a reflection of it. And then it shifted and we came back into the present moment experience, and we're actually in a representation that was more accurate. So depending on where you are in your practice and how much of what I'm describing to you either have already had the experience of seeing or are on the edge of being able to see it, this is part of the exploration of that. Why that is important is because you can begin to see how you're making the experience of yourself and how you're making the experience of the world. And you can begin to notice whether it's an accurate representation or not. And that begins to reveal your conditioned responses to things so that you begin to have agency in responding differently and interpreting differently the things that are happening. And if there's big distortions built into the way that you've been conditioned, you can begin to recognize those, set them aside, and then respond in the present moment with the conditions that are actually available to you and not constantly repeating over and over again uh, the, the habit of seeing, the habit of experiencing. So we're going to do some meditation to begin to illustrate these things. It's a basic see, hear, feel technique, dividing the world into visual experience, auditory experience, and the felt sense of the body. Three broad groupings. The felt sense of the body includes taste and smell. We don't separate them because typically if you're not eating or there aren't some strong smells, it's not that active, and so it's not worth breaking out a separate capacity for that. Visual experience is both internal and external. Auditory experience, both external and internal. The felt sense of the body, both whatever the physical quality of the body is and also the emotional quality. And then the overlay is the investigation of mind, paying attention to where your attention goes. Does it flow into a sense object? Do you hang out at a particular sense object with no intention to go anywhere? Do you notice that on the periphery other sense objects arising? Do you notice a flow of your attention from the current object to the next object? Is it a sudden shift, a flow? Is there a hesitancy? But follow that process. And then, do you know what the sensing experience is? Most of the time, the processing of what the ultimate reality experience is, the pure sensing data and what you make it into happens faster than half a second. So it just enters consciousness already attached, already fixated. The only reliable source of experiencing that process is if you hear a sound and you don't know what it is, and then that lasts longer than half a second, and then you can watch the mind trying to identify what the sensing experience is. But most of the time, that's already been completed by the time it enters into consciousness. And so this is a kind of reverse engineering. Your attention is drawn to an object, you know what the object is, and then you focus intentionally on the sensing of it, the capacity to sense it. And then generate your label, see, hear, or feel. So one word. in Buddhist thought, Vedana, which is that quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, or urgent, doesn't matter, pleasant if there's time, applies mainly to the physical sensation of the feel space. Auditory experience and visual experiences are neutral. There's an additional concept of pressure. So the brightness of the light might be unpleasant, but that's the pressure of it, not the sensing experience itself. We're not going to track Vedana tonight, but I just thought that would be helpful as you move forward. Any questions about the technique before we begin? All right, so go ahead and take your meditation posture. We'll begin with a few minutes of breath counting just to settle the mind and concentrate it. It's the evening and we're householders, almost all of us. And that will be helpful, hopefully. And so any comments or questions about the practice that we just did? Is that all pretty clear? All right. So,
George?
yeah.
Is that a new microphone system? You look like a disc jockey with your, it sounds really good.
Does it? Yeah, I was.
Yeah, it sounds very good.
I was getting some feedback that the quality of the sound wasn't good enough. And so this is the common solution to that. So it looks dramatic, I know.
How's your book doing? We haven't heard about your book for a few months.
The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect?
Yeah, yeah.
The audiobook and the paperback are going to come out in the next couple of months, so you'll hear more about it. I got some really brilliant quotes for it. If you want to indulge me for a second, I can read them to you. Let's see here. This is from the curators of the museum show I had. I'll just read one. Rooted in his own remarkable gender-questioning photographic work and frank personal history, George Haas's book is a monument to an unrivaled period of artistic experimentation and identity politics in New York that has continued to inspire change and fuel the cutting-edge culture of cool into the 21st century. Not bad. And then Lena Dunham, who's a writer as well, wrote, George Haas will take you back to a New York that feels both impossibly glamorous and unthinkably tragic, with the precision of a scalpel and the tenderness of Proust. This is a book that binds us to the places we dream of returning to, but are no longer there. George is a writer of uncommon grace. So that was also quite nice. Anything about the practice? That's good. Anyone else? Right. Thank you for coming to class. What's coming up next for us here is our summer retreat, which is next month. Take a look at that. It's up on the website. There's still a few places left. I haven't checked on it in a while. Then in July, we're going to start a series of meditation and attachment level 1 day longs. There's 4 of them. through July and August. And then in September, we're going to start another level 2. And then in December, we'll have our retreat. We haven't decided whether to do it in person or not. It'll depend on how the pandemic unfolds. But we could be actually back in person at a retreat center in the mountains. That might be nice. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that you'll make a donation that helps support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. There's links on the website to donate and also the email that you may have received about the class. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.
Thank you, George.
Bye. Bye, Harley.
Bye.